Are your curtains making your home look cheap without you even realizing it? Curtains can completely change the look of a room, but small mistakes can ruin the entire space. Hanging them too low, choosing the wrong fabric, or even picking the wrong color can make your home feel messy and outdated. Interior designers warn against these common curtain mistakes, and you might be making some of them right now. Stay with me as we go through the top 10 mistakes and see if your curtains are helping or hurting your home's style. Hanging curtains too low. Have you ever walked into a room and felt like the walls were closing in on you? It might not be the size of the room, it could be your curtains. Many people make the mistake of hanging their curtain rods too low, right above the window frame. This makes the ceiling look shorter and the space feels cramped. designers always say that the higher the curtains, the bigger and more open a room will feel. But before we get to that, let's talk about another mistake that can ruin the entire look of your space: curtains that are too short. Are yours the right length? You might be surprised. 2. Curtains that are too short. Have you ever seen curtains that stop awkwardly above the floor? It doesn't look right, does it? Curtains that are too short can make a room feel unfinished and cheap. Instead of creating a soft, elegant look, they cut off the flow of the space. It's like wearing pants that are too short. Something just feels off. Curtains should always reach the floor to give a room a complete and polished look. If they stop a few inches too high, they can make the walls seem shorter and the room feel smaller. But length isn't the only problem. What if the fabric itself is making your home look cheap? Let's talk about that next. 3. Choosing cheap or see-through fabric. Have you ever walked into a room and noticed curtains that look thin and flimsy? They don't add warmth or style, they just hang there. Cheap, see-through fabric can make a home look low quality, even if everything else is beautifully decorated. Thin curtains don't block enough light, and they often wrinkle easily, making the space look messy. Heavy or lined fabrics give a rich, elegant feel, while sheer curtains should only be used when layered with something else. But fabric isn't the only thing that matters. Patterns can also make or break your space. Let's talk about that next. Overly busy or outdated patterns. Have you ever seen curtains with loud, bold patterns that take over the whole room? Instead of adding style, they make the space feel cluttered and outdated. Big floral prints, heavy geometric designs, or old-fashioned patterns can make a home look stuck in the past. Even if the rest of your decor is modern, the wrong curtain pattern can ruin the look. Simple, solid colors or soft textures always feel more elegant and expensive. And many people make a big mistake with the type of curtain rods they use. Let's talk about that next. using tension rods for main curtains. Have you ever seen curtains hanging on a thin, weak-looking rod? It instantly makes the whole setup look cheap. Tension rods are great for small spaces like closets or temporary setups, but they are not meant for main curtains. A proper curtain rod with strong brackets gives a room a polished and stylish look. Even if your curtains are beautiful, a flimsy rod will ruin the effect. The way curtains hang makes a big difference. And there's another mistake people often forget: wrinkled curtains. Let's talk about that next. 6. Hanging wrinkled or creased curtains. Have you ever noticed curtains that look crumpled and messy? No matter how expensive they are, wrinkles can make them look cheap and uncared for. When curtains have deep creases, they take away from the beauty of the room. Instead of looking soft and elegant, they seem untidy and old. Some fabrics wrinkle more than others, but a quick steam or iron can make a huge difference. But wrinkles aren't the only problem. Sometimes, the way curtains are sized can ruin the entire look. And that's what we'll talk about next. 7. Curtains that are too narrow. Have you ever seen curtains that don't fully cover the window when closed? They look small and awkward, making the whole space feel off. Curtains that are too narrow don't create that soft, full look that makes a room feel cozy and expensive. Instead, they seem stretched and unfinished. The fabric should gather nicely, not hang flat like a bedsheet. If the curtains aren't wide enough, they won't frame the window properly, making everything look unbalanced. And choosing the wrong shade can make a room feel all wrong. Let's talk about that next. 8. Choosing the wrong curtain color. Have you ever walked into a room and felt like something was off? It might be the curtain color. Curtains take up a lot of space, so the wrong shade can ruin the whole look of a room. If the color is too dark, it can make the space feel heavy and small. If it's too light, it might not match the rest of the decor. Some colors fade over time, making curtains look old and dull. The right color should blend with the room and make everything feel balanced. But color isn't the only thing that matters. How you layer your curtains can also change the entire look. And that's what we'll talk about next. not layering curtains properly. Have you ever seen a window that looks bare, even with curtains? That's because layering is missing. A single layer of curtains can sometimes make a room feel plain and unfinished. Sheer curtains alone can look too thin, while thick curtains without a lighter layer can feel too heavy. Layering adds depth and style, making the space feel more elegant. But even if you have the perfect layers, there's one last mistake that can ruin everything: using the wrong curtain length for different window types. Let's talk about that next. Using the wrong curtain length for the window type. Have you ever seen tiny windows with long, heavy curtains that look out of place? Or big windows with curtains that barely reach the edge? Curtains that just barely cover the window look like a bad haircut, unfinished and awkward. Some windows look best with floor-length curtains, while others need shorter styles. If the curtains are too long, they can drag on the floor and look messy. If they're too short, they can make the room feel unfinished. Now that you know these 10 mistakes, take a look at your own curtains. Are they making your home look stylish or cheap? know the 10 curtain mistakes that can make a home look cheap. A few small changes can make a big difference in your space. Take a look at your own curtains. Are they the right length, color, and style? Fixing these mistakes will make your home feel more stylish and elegant. If you found this helpful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more home design tips. See you in the next video.